Let's take a look at those nests that we've got live cameras on at the moment here. So we've got a great range of species. We've got kestrels there, we've got buzzards, we've got the swallows, we've got the pied wagtails, but there is something missing. And Sarah Jane wrote to us on Twitter and said, I'm enjoying watching all of the different birds, but I'm missing the blue tits.
She's absolutely right. We don't have a blue tit nest this year. First time ever since I've been doing the watches and since you've been doing it as well. But people haven't just let us know that they're disappointed we haven't got a blue tit nest. They're also upset that they haven't got a blue tit nest in their garden, or that it's failed. We had this on Twitter from Anne Ely. There seems to be a large death rate amongst blue tit chicks this year all around the country. All 6 of my chicks have perished. John Buckman wrote me a letter that I received today. No blue tits in the nest box this year, the first time in 8 years. Well, first of all, let me tell you that we did actually have a nest in a nest box before we started the series. We put a live camera on it. They laid the eggs hatched, it had 6 chicks, and then one by one they just didn't make it. They weren't getting enough food until the last one perished, and that nest, I'm afraid to say, was unsuccessful before we even came on air.
And there are lots of comments like Anne Ely's on social media, but that's subjective comment, and we all like that and we like to share it, but what we also need is some quantitative science. So we spoke to Dr. Charlotte Reagan, who works at Whiteham Wood in Oxford, and there they've been collecting data about tit species since 1947, and she's given us some of the preliminary data from this year. So here is the proportion of clutches that failed from the earliest broods of great tits that were hatched last year, 2020. And look, here we've got tremendous amount of success. Only 4% of them failed. This year, a very different picture. So here, 24% of the clutches from those earliest broods have failed. And it gets worse, I'm afraid, when we look at the young birds in the nest. Similar sort of data from 2020 here, 4% of a proportion of those chicks from the earliest broods died before reaching 2 weeks old. This year, 37%. So that's the sort of mortality that we're looking at, and Anne Ely has reported, and we've seen here at Wild Ken Hill. It's that 37% of young birds dying in the nest before they're 2 weeks old. And this isn't just down to weather, this is also down to a phenological mismatch.
And simply put, that's all about timings. Now, the success of blue tit relies on lots of different things. It relies on oak trees, winter moths, and hatching of blue tits. So the hatching of the winter moth caterpillars is timed with the bud burst of the oak trees. So basically, the buds need to be out in time for the caterpillars so that they have something to eat when they hatch. The blue tit chicks hatch to coincide with an abundance of those caterpillars. So adult tits have food to feed their chicks. But this year, this rather strange spring has changed the timing of all of that.
Yeah, what happens if the timing of that system gets messed up? I've got a fantastic prop over here. You're going to love this one. Look, the months of the year, January, Feb, March, April, May here. This is the oak tree. Here's the caterpillar that feeds on it. Here's the blue tit that eats the caterpillar. Now, normally, oak leaves start to get their buds around here, and then they start to open towards the end of April and into May. The caterpillars then need to be feeding on those, so they appear just a little bit later, and the blue tits time their breeding here so that when the chicks hatch, there's an abundance of these caterpillars. That's when it's all in order. But what about if there's a mismatch that's been, enacted by the weather, as there was this year? So it was really, really cold this year, and the leaves on the oak trees didn't open until much later, which meant that the caterpillars were much later, but the blue tits, unfortunately, didn't switch to breeding later. It's not within their capacity to do that. They were breeding at the normal time, which means that by the time the chicks had hatched and they were hoping for this glut of caterpillars on the oak leaves, unfortunately, they simply weren't there yet. And what made it worse was that when the rains came, they washed all of the caterpillars off of the trees onto the ground, and blue tits like to forage up there in the canopy. So whilst the robins and blackbirds had a bonanza of food on the ground, the poor old blue tits were going hungry.
It certainly seems, doesn't it? I mean, from the data that we've got already and people's comments, that this is going to be a really bad year for blue tits. But they do have the capacity to recover.
Yeah, and there are some good news.
There is a little bit of good news, I'm pleased to tell you. I mean, just take a look at this photo. This is from Melissa Collum from Harefield in London. There are 18 blue tit chicks in her nest box, which is a phenomenal number. There are usually only about 8 to 10. I reckon that's probably 2 broods in there.
Bit of egg dumping.
I think it's a bit of egg
as
dumping.
we've seen with the other birds here, the partridge, etc.
But you know, there are success stories. I was chatting to Zoe Ball on Radio 2 this morning.
Oh, you name dropper.
I was, and she's got a nest in her garden, and so you know there are nests around. We'll just keep our fingers crossed that at least some of those are going to be successful.
And Melissa, do let us know how your 18 blue tits get on. We'd love to hear. That would be fantastic.